The year was 1943, and the Imperial Japanese Army faced a crisis that would define the final years of World War II in the Pacific. As Allied forces pushed closer to the Japanese homeland, military engineers in Tokyo worked frantically on a weapon they believed would turn the tide of battle. The Type 93 flamethrower was born not from innovation, but from desperation. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the training grounds of Camp Narashino, 20 kilometers east of Tokyo. The morning fog hung heavy over the parade ground as he watched a demonstration that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young private, no older than 19, strapped a metal contraption onto his back. The device looked like two cylindrical tanks welded together, connected by a series of tubes to a gun-like nozzle. The instructor, a grizzled sergeant with burn scars covering half his face, barked orders with mechanical precision. The private steadied himself, aimed at a wooden target 30 meters away, and pressed the trigger. A stream of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, transforming the morning air into an inferno. The wooden structure disappeared in seconds, consumed by flames that burned with an unnatural intensity. Yamamoto felt his stomach tighten. He had seen death before, had led men into battle on the Chinese front, but something about this weapon felt different, wrong even. The sergeant turned to address the assembled officers, his voice carrying across the silent field. The Type 93, he explained, represented the cutting edge of Japanese military technology. It could project flames up to 40 meters, could clear enemy bunkers, could turn the fortified caves of Pacific Islands into crematoriums. Each unit weighed 23 kilograms when fully loaded, containing approximately 14 liters of fuel mixture. The Empire had ordered 10,000 units to be manufactured immediately. What the sergeant did not mention, what none of them knew yet, was that the Type 93 carried a fatal flaw embedded in its very design. The fuel tanks, made from thin pressed steel to reduce weight, could not withstand the internal pressure generated during operation. The rubber seals, manufactured from inferior materials due to wartime shortages, degraded rapidly under heat. Most critically, the entire fuel supply sat directly against the operator's back, with only a thin cotton-padded vest for protection. Yamamoto approached the demonstration area after the presentation ended. He examined the weapon closely, running his fingers along the welded seams, testing the weight of the tanks. The metal felt thin, almost fragile. He lifted the nozzle, surprised by how crude the trigger mechanism seemed. This was supposed to be their advantage? The sergeant noticed his inspection and moved closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He had tested the first prototypes, he confessed, had seen things that kept him awake at night. During field trials in Manchuria, 3 of the first 5 operators had died, not from enemy fire, but from their own weapons. The fuel tanks had ruptured during operation, coating the soldiers in burning liquid. The official reports called them training accidents. Yamamoto felt a chill despite the morning warmth. He asked the obvious question. If the weapon was so dangerous, why were they moving forward with mass production? The sergeant's scarred face remained expressionless as he delivered his response. Orders from headquarters. The Americans were coming, and desperate times demanded desperate measures. Besides, Japanese soldiers were expected to embrace death for the emperor. What difference did it make if that death came from the enemy or from their own equipment? That afternoon, Yamamoto returned to his barracks and wrote in his journal, a practice he had maintained since the war began. He described the demonstration, the weapons specifications, and his growing unease. He wrote about the young private who had operated the flamethrower, how his hands had trembled slightly as he strapped on the tanks, how relief had flooded his face when the demonstration ended without incident. Yamamoto could not have known that within 18 months, that same private would die on a beach in Iwo Jima, his back erupting in flames after a single rifle bullet punctured his fuel tank. He could not have known that the Type 93 would earn a nickname among Japanese soldiers, the suicide weapon. He could not have known that military records, declassified decades later, would reveal the horrifying truth. Of every 10 soldiers equipped with the Type 93 flamethrower, 9 would die not in glorious combat, but consumed by the very weapon they carried. The sun set over Camp Narashino that evening, casting long shadows across the training ground. In warehouses across Japan, workers assembled thousands of Type 93 units, each one a potential death sentence for its operator. The machinery of war ground forward, indifferent to the lives it would consume. The conference room in the Tokyo arsenal smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. It was November 1943, and Captain Hideaki Sato sat across from 3 civilian engineers who had designed the Type 93. Outside, air raid sirens wailed in the distance, a reminder that American B-29 bombers were gradually tightening their grip on Japanese airspace. Sato spread technical drawings across the table, his finger tracing the fuel tank assembly. He had spent 3 weeks reviewing incident reports from the front lines, and the pattern was undeniable. The weapon was killing its own operators at an alarming rate. He needed answers. The lead engineer, a thin man named Kobayashi, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He explained the constraints they had faced during development. The military had demanded maximum fuel capacity with minimum weight. Steel was in short supply, aluminum was reserved for aircraft production, and copper was needed for ammunition. They had been forced to use the thinnest gauge steel that could theoretically hold the fuel mixture. Theoretically, that word hung in the air like a confession. Sato pulled out a folder containing photographs from Tarawa. The images showed the charred remains of Japanese soldiers, their spines twisted at impossible angles, the metal tanks fused to what remained of their backs. One photograph captured the moment of death, a soldier engulfed in flames, his mouth open in a silent scream while his comrades ran in terror. The second engineer, younger and visibly shaken by the photographs, admitted what headquarters refused to acknowledge. The Type 93 had 3 critical design flaws that made operator death almost inevitable. First, the fuel tanks could not withstand enemy fire. A single rifle bullet could penetrate the thin steel, igniting the fuel mixture instantly, unlike American or German flamethrowers, which used thicker armor plating around vital components. The Type 93 offered no protection. The operator became a walking bomb. Second, the pressure system was fundamentally unstable. To achieve the 40-meter range that the military demanded, the internal pressure had to reach dangerous levels. The seals and valves manufactured from deteriorating rubber compounds frequently failed during operation. When they did, fuel would spray backward, coating the operator before igniting. Third, and most damning, the ignition system sat mere centimeters from the fuel tanks. A malfunction, a spark at the wrong moment, or even excessive heat from prolonged use could trigger catastrophic failure. The engineers had recommended relocating the ignition mechanism, but that would have required complete redesign. Time was something Japan no longer had. Kobayashi lit another cigarette with trembling hands. He confessed that he had submitted 7 formal requests to halt production until safety modifications could be implemented. All 7 had been denied. The military prioritized quantity over quality, bodies over engineering sense. Sato closed the folder and stood. He asked one final question. If they knew the weapon was a death sentence, how did they sleep at night? Kobayashi met his gaze, his face hollow with exhaustion and guilt. They did not sleep, he replied. They simply counted the days until Japan would answer for its sins. Private First Class Kenji Tanaka crouched in the volcanic sand of Peleliu Island, his Type 93 strapped to his back like a death sentence. It was September 1944, and the Americans had been bombing the island for 3 days straight. The heat was unbearable, made worse by the weight of 14 liters of fuel pressing against his spine. He had volunteered for flamethrower duty, not out of courage, but because it came with extra rations and a promise that his family would receive additional compensation if he died. His younger sister needed medicine his parents could not afford. The choice had been simple: risk his life or watch her suffer. But no one had told him the truth about the Type 93. Tanaka had watched 4 men die during training alone. The first had stumbled while crossing a trench, the impact rupturing a fuel line. He had burned for 40 seconds before someone found the mercy to shoot him. The second had fired his weapon successfully, then turned to retreat when the pressure valve failed. The back spray had ignited before he could remove the tanks. The third and fourth had died when enemy fire found their fuel tanks during a practice assault. The survivors learned to recognize the sound: a sharp crack like a branch breaking, followed by a wet whoosh as fuel sprayed outward, then screaming. Always screaming. Tanaka had written a letter to his sister 3 nights earlier, though he knew he would never mail it. He described the weapon in detail, explained why he would probably die, and asked her to forgive him for making such a foolish choice. He had hidden the letter in his helmet, hoping someone would find it and send it home after he was gone. Sergeant Nakamura moved down the line, checking equipment with mechanical efficiency. He stopped at Tanaka, examining the fuel tank connections with experienced eyes. The sergeant had operated a Type 93 at Guadalcanal and survived, one of the rare few. His hands bore thick scars from chemical burns, and he walked with a limp from when a piece of shrapnel had grazed his fuel tank without puncturing it. Nakamura spoke quietly, his advice delivered with the weight of hard experience. Stay low, move fast, and never hesitate. The moment you pause, you become a target. Keep the tanks away from cover where ricochets might strike them. If you feel wetness on your back, drop everything and run. Do not try to be a hero. The Type 93 turns heroes into corpses. He pointed across the beach to where American Marines were establishing positions. They would attack at dawn, he explained. High Command expected the Flamethrower units to clear the forward bunkers. Of the 12 men assigned Type 93 units in their company, Nakamura estimated 3 would survive the assault. Maybe 4 if they were lucky. Tanaka adjusted the straps on his tanks, feeling the metal press against his shoulder blades. He thought about his sister, about the medicine, about whether his death would mean anything at all. The sun began to set over Peleliu, painting the sky the same orange as the flames that would soon consume him. February 19, 1945. Mount Suribachi loomed over the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima like a monument to death itself. Corporal Hiroshi Matsuda pressed his body against the inside of a concrete bunker, the Type 93 feeling heavier with each passing minute. Outside, the largest naval bombardment in Pacific War history had turned the island into a vision of hell. Matsuda commanded a 3-man flamethrower team defending Cave 17, a network of tunnels carved into the volcanic rock. His 2 companions, both teenagers conscripted months earlier, had never seen combat before yesterday. Now they huddled in the darkness, their Type 93 units leaking small amounts of fuel that pooled on the cave floor. The smell was nauseating, a chemical stench that mixed with sulfur from the volcanic vents. The Americans came at dawn, their voices echoing through the tunnel system. Matsuda heard the distinctive sound of English commands, the clatter of equipment, the cautious footsteps of Marines clearing caves. He gave the signal. His team moved to their positions, emerging from concealed firing ports that overlooked the main tunnel approach. The first American squad never knew what hit them. Matsuda triggered his Type 93 and liquid fire transformed the tunnel into an inferno. Men screamed, their silhouettes dancing against the flames as they tried desperately to retreat. The smell of burning flesh filled the confined space. It was effective. It was horrifying. It was exactly what the weapon had been designed to do. But success came with a price. The heat in the enclosed tunnel caused the pressure in Matsuda's fuel tanks to spike. He felt the tanks expanding against his back, heard the metal groaning under stress. The rubber seals began to deteriorate from the extreme temperature. He needed to retreat, to let the weapon cool. But more Americans were coming. His first companion, a boy named Yoshida who had turned 18 3 weeks earlier, fired his weapon at the second wave of Marines. The stream of fire caught 2 soldiers, but the back pressure from firing in such a confined space caused an immediate seal failure. Fuel sprayed across Yoshida's neck and shoulder. He screamed, clawing at the straps, trying to remove the tanks before the fuel ignited from residual heat. He was still screaming when the fuel caught fire. Matsuda watched helplessly as Yoshida stumbled backward into the cave, a human torch illuminating the volcanic walls with dancing shadows. The boy fell, his Type 93 rupturing on impact and sending a wave of burning fuel across the cave floor. The third team member, trying to help, stepped into the spreading flames. His own fuel tank caught fire seconds later. Matsuda ran. He abandoned his position, his weapon, his duty, and his dying comrades. He fled deeper into the tunnel network, the screams echoing behind him. He found a side chamber and tore the Type 93 from his back, hurling it against the wall. The tanks dented but did not rupture. He collapsed, shaking, surrounded by darkness and the distant sounds of battle. 2 of his men were dead. Not from American bullets, from their own weapons. The war ended on August 15, 1945, but the true cost of the Type 93 flamethrower remained buried in classified documents for decades. It was not until 1982 that historian Dr. Robert Mitchell researching Japanese weapons systems at the National Archives in Washington, stumbled upon a folder that would rewrite the narrative of the Pacific War. The folder contained captured Japanese military records from the final year of the war. Among requisition forms and supply reports, Mitchell found something extraordinary: detailed casualty statistics for specialized weapons units. The numbers were staggering and precise, recorded with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized Japanese military bureaucracy. Between 1943 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army produced 10,429 Type 93 flamethrower units. They were distributed to infantry divisions across the Pacific Theater: Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller islands. Military records tracked each unit, each operator, and each casualty with cold efficiency. The statistics told a story of systematic death. Of the 8,547 soldiers trained to operate the Type 93, a total of 7,906 died in combat. But the details revealed the horrifying truth that headquarters had tried to suppress. Only 894 operators were killed by direct enemy action while using the weapon effectively against Allied forces. The remaining 7,012 died from weapon malfunction, fuel tank ruptures, seal failures, pressure explosions, or accidental ignition. The mathematics was brutal and undeniable. 92.4% of Type 93 operators died because of design flaws, not enemy fire. Mitchell found testimony from surviving operators, interviews conducted by American intelligence officers in 1946. Corporal Hiroshi Matsuda, who had survived Iwo Jima by abandoning his weapon, described the Type 93 as a murder device disguised as military equipment. He explained how soldiers dreaded flamethrower assignment more than frontline infantry duty, how some had deliberately injured themselves to avoid carrying the weapon, how officers had resorted to selecting operators by lottery because no one would volunteer. Another survivor, Sergeant Ichiro Yamashita, provided technical analysis that confirmed what the engineers had known all along. The thin steel tanks could not withstand sustained use. The pressure system was fundamentally unsafe. The ignition mechanism was positioned recklessly. Every design choice prioritized offensive capability over operator survival. The Type 93 was not a weapon. It was a method of suicide dressed in military necessity. Most damning were internal memos from the Tokyo arsenal, discovered in the same archive. Engineers had warned headquarters repeatedly about the fatal design flaws. They had proposed modifications, redesigns, safety improvements. Every proposal had been rejected with the same justification. Japan needed quantity immediately, not quality eventually. Soldiers were expendable. Equipment was scarce. The war could not wait for perfection. Mitchell published his findings in 1984. The article caused controversy in both Japan and America, forcing both nations to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Type 93 flamethrower stood as testament to the depths of desperation, the cost of failed engineering, and the human price of military expediency. It represented not just a tactical failure, but a moral one. 80 years have passed since the last Type 93 flamethrower was fired in combat. Today, only 3 complete examples survive in museums. One at the Yushukan War Memorial Museum in Tokyo, one at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, and one at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Each sits behind protective glass, a rusted monument to engineering failure and human cost. In 2019, Kenji Tanaka's letter was finally delivered. A construction crew excavating old military installations on Peleliu discovered a corroded helmet buried in volcanic sand. Inside, preserved by chance and sealed in a waterproof pouch, was the letter he had written to his sister 75 years earlier. The sister, now 91 years old and living in Osaka, wept as a translator read her brother's words aloud. He had been 19 when he died. His body never recovered, his death officially attributed to combat action. The truth, written in fading ink, told a different story. Hiroshi Matsuda lived until 2003, dying at age 81, surrounded by family. He never spoke about Iwo Jima except once in 1995, during a veterans' reconciliation ceremony. He stood before an audience of former Japanese and American soldiers and described watching his companions burn alive from their own weapons. He apologized not for fighting, but for the silence that had allowed the truth to remain buried for so long. Several American veterans approached him afterward, sharing their own memories of watching Japanese soldiers erupt in flames before their weapons ever engaged Allied positions. They had assumed it was some kind of desperate suicide tactic. None had realized they were witnessing systematic equipment failure. Modern military historians classify the Type 93 as one of the worst weapons ever deployed in modern warfare. Engineering students study its design flaws as cautionary examples of what happens when political pressure overrides technical expertise. The weapon appears in ethics courses at military academies worldwide, illustrating the moral responsibility of engineers and the catastrophic consequences of sacrificing soldier safety for tactical advantage. In Japan, the Type 93 has become a symbol of the darker aspects of wartime decision-making. Documentaries explore how desperation and resource scarcity led to weapons that killed their own users. Survivor testimonies, once suppressed out of shame and military censorship, are now preserved in national archives and taught in schools as part of comprehensive war education. The numbers remain unchanged: 10,429 units produced, 8,547 operators trained, 7,906 killed, 92.4% died from design flaws. These statistics, once classified and deliberately obscured, now serve as a permanent reminder of the human cost of failed engineering and desperate military planning. The last known Type 93 operator, a man who had carried the weapon during training but never fired it in combat, died in 2018 at age 94. With his passing, direct memory of the weapon faded into history. What remains are the documents, the statistics, the photographs, and the lessons learned at a terrible price. Some weapons are remembered for their effectiveness. The Type 93 is remembered for the men it killed before they ever faced the enemy.